Echoing like a cracked whip through the quiet tailoring shop, his gold lighter snapped shut. He didn't yell, nor did he even move, yet the air pressure in the room suddenly dropped, becoming heavy and suffocating. Beside him, Lyra held the yellow measuring tape taut across his broad shoulders, her knuckles accidentally brushing the warm, hard line of his collarbone. "Do you have a boyfriend?" he asked, his voice low, scraping the bottom of his throat. "Not yet," she murmured around the pins in her mouth. That was her first mistake. The air in the shop tasted like hot iron, damp wool, and dust. It was the scent of her entire life, baked into the peeling wallpaper and the scarred hardwood floors of her father's old bespoke tailor shop on 4th Street. Usually it was a comforting smell. Today it was entirely eclipsed by the sharp scent of ozone, rain, and bitter espresso radiating from the man standing on her fitting pedestal. Noah Moretti, Capo of the West Side. He wasn't moving. He didn't need to. Men like Noah occupied space like a dying star, pulling everything into their gravity, dense and unyielding. He was staring straight ahead at the trifold mirror, his face a study in bored violence. He wasn't classically handsome. His nose had clearly been broken more than once and set slightly off-center, and there was a pale, jagged line carving through the stubble on his jaw. But the sheer, unapologetic weight of his presence made the physical flaws irrelevant. "Arms up," Lyra said. Her voice was flat. She prided herself on that flatness. It was the armor she wore against the men who came into this shop with blood on their cuffs and thousands of dollars in cash stuffed into their coats. Noah raised his arms. The movement was smooth, predatory. The fabric of his dress shirt stretched across a chest that felt less like flesh and more like poured concrete. She stepped closer, the wooden floorboards groaning under her boots. She looped the cold, plastic measuring tape around his chest, pulling it snug just under his arms. Her face was inches from his throat. She could see the steady, heavy thud of his pulse against his skin. She could smell the faint trace of gun oil mixed with expensive vetiver cologne. It made her stomach tighten, not with romance, but with the primal animal instinct of being too close to an apex predator. She wrote the number down on the small notepad resting on the cutting table. 32 inches, she mumbled. Behind her, by the frosted glass door, his shadow stood guard. A massive guy named Paulie, who breathed exclusively through his mouth and looked at her like she was a slightly annoying insect. He shifted, his leather jacket creaking, the wet sound of tires hissing on the rainy street outside, bleeding through the glass. Lyra moved to measure Noah's waist. This required stepping even closer, invading the personal space that everyone else in the city instinctively gave him. She knelt on one knee, the joints popping loudly in the quiet room. She pulled the tape around his waist, right over the heavy leather belt. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the holster tucked into the small of his back. She didn't flinch. She just pulled the tape, got the number, and stood back up. "You don't talk much, Lyra," Noah said. His voice was a physical vibration in the quiet shop. "I charge by the suit, Mr. Moretti, not by the syllable." A dark, slow amusement flickered in the mirror. He looked at her reflection, his dark eyes catching hers. They were the color of wet coffee grounds, dark, opaque, and entirely unreadable. "Most people talk too much when I'm in the room," he noted casually. "They try to fill the silence. They get nervous." "I'm focusing on the drape of your trousers," she lied. She was nervous. Her armpits were damp with cold sweat, and her hands had a slight tremor that she was working very hard to hide. But she had rent to pay. The shop was 3 months behind on the lease. The heating grate was broken, and the bank was sending letters with increasingly red font. Noah's money was dirty, but it spent exactly the same as clean money. She picked up her chalk. Hold still. I need to mark the shoulder seam. Lyra stepped up onto the small wooden stool to reach his shoulders properly. The proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating off him. She dragged the flat edge of the chalk across the dark fabric, leaving a sharp white line. "Do you have a boyfriend?" The question came out of nowhere. It wasn't a casual inquiry. It dropped into the room like an anvil. It was a demand for data. She froze, the chalk hovering an inch from his collar. Her brain stuttered. She had expected complaints about the fabric, or a veiled threat about getting the suit done by Friday. She hadn't expected him to ask about her personal life. She looked down at his face. He wasn't looking in the mirror anymore. He had turned his head slightly, and his dark eyes were locked onto her face. The amusement was gone. She put 2 pins between her lips to free her hand, trying to buy a second of time. She needed to answer carefully. Say yes, and he might see it as a challenge. Say no, and it might sound like an invitation. She settled for the cynical, exhausted truth. "Not yet," she murmured around the pins. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. The gold lighter he had been idly turning over in his right hand snapped shut with a violent, sharp crack that made her jump. His hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles instantly turning bone white. The muscles in his jaw locked so hard she thought she might hear his teeth shatter. The air in the room stopped moving. Paulie, by the door, instantly stopped chewing his gum and straightened up, his hand dropping toward his coat. Noah's eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide, eclipsing the brown. It was pure, unfiltered possession, a sudden, violent jealousy over something he didn't even own. "What do you mean, not yet?" he asked softly. The softness was terrifying. It was the hiss of a fuse burning down to the powder. Lyra stared at the tense line of his jaw, the white-knuckled grip he had on nothing at all. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a trapped bird battering a cage, but her face remained an impassive mask. Growing up in this neighborhood taught you one golden rule: never show a stray dog that you're afraid of it. "It means," she said slowly, carefully removing the pins from her mouth so she wouldn't accidentally swallow them, "that I am currently single, but I do not intend to die alone. Eventually, I assume, I'll find the time to date." His eyes tracked the movement of her lips, then flicked back up to hers. "Who?" The bluntness of it caught her off guard. "Who what? Who are you planning to date? Is there someone specific you're waiting on?" His voice was grating, tight. He shifted his weight, and the sudden movement made her instinctively take a half step back, her heel slipping off the edge of the wooden stool. She lost her balance. It wasn't a dramatic, swooning fall. It was an awkward, ungraceful stumble. She pitched forward, her hand shooting out to catch herself. She grabbed the nearest solid object, which happened to be Noah's bicep. Her fingers dug into the hard muscle, and in her panic, her other hand, the one holding the sharp tailor's pins, slammed against his chest. She felt the unmistakable resistance of a pin-piercing fabric, and then the subtle, yielding pop as it broke through skin. Noah let out a sharp hiss. Lyra scrambled back, dropping the pins onto the floor where they scattered with a sound like rain on a tin roof. "I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry." Paulie was across the room in a second, moving with shocking speed for a man his size. "Boss?" Noah held up a single hand, stopping the bodyguard in his tracks. He didn't look at Paulie. He didn't look down at his chest. He just looked at her. "I'm fine, Paulie. Wait outside." "But outside." The word was barely above a whisper, but it cracked with absolute authority. Polly swallowed, gave her a look that promised a slow death if she breathed wrong, and backed out the heavy glass door, the bell jingling cheerfully overhead, a stark contrast to the thick tension inside. They were alone. Lyra stood frozen near the cutting table, staring at the small, blooming dot of crimson staining the crisp white cotton of his dress shirt, right over his pectoral. She had stabbed the Capo of the West Side. People had been dumped in the river for spilling drinks on this man. She reached blindly behind her, grabbing a scrap of clean linen from the table. "I slipped," she said, her voice finally betraying a slight shake. "Press this to it." She held the cloth out. No, I didn't take it. Instead, he stepped off the pedestal. He moved toward her, slow and deliberate. The sheer physical size of him seemed to double when he was off the little stage. He backed her against the cutting edge of the drafting table. The cold wood pressed uncomfortably into her lower back. He stopped when the toes of his expensive, mud-flecked Oxfords touched the tips of her worn-out boots. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could see the exact shade of the dark stubble on his chin. He reached out, but not for the cloth. He wrapped his large, calloused fingers around her wrist. His grip was entirely firm, a velvet vice. He pulled her hand, the one holding the linen, toward his chest. He pressed her hand flat against the prick. The heat of his skin bled through the thin fabric. The thud of his heart was steady, deep, and surprisingly calm. It completely contradicted the feral intensity in his eyes. "You didn't answer my question, Lyra," he said, staring down at her. She couldn't breathe properly. The smell of him, smoke, rain, copper from the blood, and that sharp, clean cologne was suffocating. She looked up into his dark, obsessive eyes, realizing with a cold spike of dread that he wasn't angry about the pin. He didn't even care. He was still angry about the boyfriend. "There's no one specific," she forced out, her voice sounding thin and pathetic to her own ears. "I work 14 hours a day. I barely have time to sleep, let alone entertain." His thumb moved, slowly stroking the delicate skin on the inside of her wrist, right over her erratic pulse. It was a grossly intimate gesture, contrasting violently with the blood underneath her palm and the gun strapped to his waist. "Good," he breathed. The tension in his jaw finally relaxed. The dangerous pressure in the room eased just a fraction, like a valve being released. "Keep it that way." She frowned, a spark of genuine irritation finally burning through the fear. She tugged her hand, but his grip didn't loosen. "You don't get to dictate my life, Mr. Moretti. You pay for my tailoring, not my time outside this shop." A dark smile touched the corner of his mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. "I pay for whatever I want, Lyra. And I want your undivided attention." He finally let go of her wrist. The sudden absence of his heat left her hand feeling strangely cold. He stepped back, casually buttoning his vest over the bloodstain as if it didn't exist. "Have the suit ready by Thursday," he said, turning toward the door. "You said Friday," she argued, clinging to the mundane details to anchor herself. "Thursday," he repeated, pushing the glass door open. The wet, cold air of the street rushed in, smelling of exhaust and wet pavement. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes lingering on her face. "And Lyra?" "What?" "If some guy asks you out before Thursday, tell him you're busy." The door closed, the bell jingling a final time. Lyra stood alone in the dim, dusty shop, her hand still gripping the blood-spotted linen. She was trembling. It wasn't just fear. It was a terrifying, deeply buried thrill that made her feel sick to her stomach. Lyra's subway ride home was a blur of flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of wet wool from the tired commuters around her. She sat huddled in the hard plastic seat, staring at the reflection of her own exhausted face in the dark window. Her knuckles still felt tight. Her wrist, where Noah had grabbed her, felt hyper-aware, as if he had left a fingerprint burned into the skin. She hated him. She needed to establish that fact clearly in her own mind. He was a criminal. He was a thug in a bespoke suit. He preyed on people, extorted businesses, broke lives for profit. The fact that she was obsessively jealous over a passing comment she made shouldn't be thrilling. It should be terrifying. It was terrifying. But as the train rattled through the dark tunnels under the city, she couldn't stop thinking about the absolute, unflinching focus in his dark eyes when he pinned her against the table. No one had ever looked at her like that. Like she was the only breathing thing in the room. Like she was something to be guarded. She rubbed her tired eyes, disgusted with herself. "You're romanticizing a mobster because you're lonely and broke," she scolded herself silently. "Get a grip." Her apartment building was a decaying brick structure on the edge of the garment district. The radiator in the lobby had been broken since 2021, and the air smelled heavily of boiled cabbage and feral cats. She trudged up the 3 flights of stairs, her legs feeling like lead. She fumbled with her keys, the metal biting into her cold fingers. The hallway was dim, the single bulb at the end flickering ominously. She jammed the key into the lower lock, turned it, and then reached for the deadbolt. It was already unlocked. She froze. The exhaustion vanished, instantly replaced by a cold spike of adrenaline. She always locked the deadbolt. Always. Living alone in this neighborhood, it was a religious habit. She stared at the brass cylinder. Had she forgotten this morning? She had been rushed, trying to get to the shop early to finish a hem for Mrs. Gable. But no. She distinctly remembered the heavy clunk of the bolt sliding into place. She didn't move. She listened. The building was full of the usual noises, muffled televisions, water hammering in the pipes, a baby crying a floor below. But from inside her apartment, there was nothing. Total silence. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket, her fingers wrapping tightly around the small canister of pepper spray attached to her keychain. It felt pathetic, a plastic toy against whatever might be waiting inside. She pushed the door open an inch. "Hello," she called out, hating how small her voice sounded. Nothing. She shoved the door wide open and hit the light switch on the wall. The cheap, warm light flooded the small living space. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The threadbare green sofa was pushed against the far wall. The stack of mail was still on the rickety coffee table. Her dying pothos plant sat on the windowsill, its yellowing leaves drooping over the edge. She let out a shaky breath, stepping inside and kicking the door shut behind her. She immediately locked the deadbolt, threw the chain, and leaned against the wood, closing her eyes. Paranoid, she thought. You're just jumpy because of Moretti. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and walked into the tiny kitchen to put the kettle on. She needed tea. She needed sleep. She needed to figure out how to finish a 3-piece suit by Thursday without making a mistake that could get her killed. As she reached for the kettle on the stove, her hand stopped in midair. Sitting dead center on her scratched Formica countertop was a box. It wasn't a cardboard shipping box. It was sleek, matte black, tied with an impossibly thick, luxurious crimson ribbon. It looked completely alien in her cramped, dingy kitchen. It was the kind of box that belonged in a high-end boutique on Fifth Avenue, not sitting next to her half-empty jar of instant coffee. Her heart resumed its frantic battering against her ribs. Someone had been in here. Someone had bypassed her locks, walked into her home, and left this. She stepped back, suddenly hyper-aware of the shadows in the corners of the room. She checked the single window in the kitchen. Locked. The fire escape window in the living room. Locked. She was alone. But the violation hung in the air, heavy and thick. She stared at the black box. Her hands were shaking again. She shouldn't touch it. She should call the police. But she knew the police wouldn't care about a box. And deep down, she already knew exactly who had sent it. She walked slowly back to the counter. The ribbon was soft, like silk. She pulled the tail end, and the bow fell apart silently. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black tissue paper, was a heavy antique silver deadbolt lock. It was massive, the kind of industrial-grade hardware you'd find on a bank vault, not a cheap apartment door. Tucked beneath the heavy metal cylinder was a small, thick card made of expensive, cream-colored cardstock. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, and slashed across the paper in dark ink. Your locks are a joke. Fix it. L. She stared at the note, a violent mixture of anger, fear, and something hot and confusing rising in her throat. He had sent someone to break into her apartment just to prove that he could, just to remind her that her boundaries didn't exist in his world. He was watching her. She touched the cold, heavy silver of the deadbolt. It was a threat disguised as protection. It was his way of saying, no one else can get in, but I already am. She crumpled the note in her fist, the sharp edges of the thick paper biting into her palm. She should have thrown it in the trash. She should have thrown the lock through the window. Instead, she walked over to the front door, staring at her cheap brass lock, and wondered if she had a screwdriver in her toolbox. Thursday arrived tasting of copper and stale coffee. Lyra had slept a total of 6 hours since Monday. Her fingers were blistered from the heavy shears, and her lower back hummed with a dull, constant ache. The 3-piece suit hung on the wooden valet stand in the center of the shop, a masterpiece of charcoal gray wool and silk lining. It looked like armor. It looked like money. The bell above the door jingled at exactly noon. She didn't look up from the steam press right away. The heavy iron hissed, sending a cloud of damp heat into her face. She pressed the pedal, releasing the steam, and finally turned. Noah walked in alone. No Polly at the door today. The absence of the giant bodyguard made the shop feel inexplicably smaller, concentrating all the danger directly into the man crossing the floorboards. Noah wore a black overcoat that hung open, revealing a dark turtleneck and the ever-present leather shoulder holster. He stopped a few feet from the valet stand, his dark eyes scanning the suit. "You look like hell, Lyra," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an insult. It was a clinical observation. She wiped her damp forehead with the back of her wrist, feeling the grit of chalk dust on her skin. "Customer service is extra, Mr. Moretti. The suit is ready." She pointed to the fitting room, a cramped alcove partitioned by a heavy velvet curtain. He didn't move toward it immediately. His eyes shifted from the suit to her, tracking the dark circles under her eyes, the messy bun slipping down the back of her neck, the tape measure draped like a dead snake around her shoulders. "Did you install the lock?" he asked. The casual way he said it made her jaw ache. Her stomach gave that same sick, thrilling lurch it had on Monday, but the exhaustion gave her a reckless edge. "I did," she said flatly, "though I'm billing you for the hour it took me to chisel out the door frame." A faint, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Send the invoice to my accountant. Don't ever send someone into my home again," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. She stepped away from the steam press, closing the distance between them. "I don't care who you are. I don't care how much you pay me. You cross my threshold again without an invitation, and I'll call the cops." Noah looked down at her. The smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, heavy stare that physically pushed against her lungs. He reached out. She didn't flinch, though every instinct screamed at her to step back. His knuckles, rough and calloused, brushed against her cheekbone. The contact was shockingly gentle. His hand smelled faintly of leather and cold outside air. "If someone broke into your apartment, Lyra, the cops would arrive in 20 minutes to take a report," he murmured, his thumb grazing the bruised-looking skin under her eye. "They wouldn't stop it. They wouldn't protect you. And you think a lock will?" "No." His thumb stilled. "But it buys you 3 minutes, which is all I need to get there." Her breath hitched. She hated how her body reacted to him. The sudden spike in her pulse, the way her skin flushed under his touch. She jerked her head back, breaking the contact. The loss of his warmth felt like a sudden draft. "Put the suit on," she ordered, her voice sounding incredibly brittle. He held her gaze for a long second, dissecting her panic, before he finally turned and took the hangers from the valet stand. He disappeared behind the velvet curtain. She stood by the cutting table, her hands pressed flat against the wood to stop their trembling. The rustle of clothing from behind the curtain felt painfully loud. She heard the clink of a belt buckle, the heavy thud of his boots on the floor. When he stepped out, the air left the room. The suit fit flawlessly. The charcoal wool draped over his broad shoulders without a single wrinkle, tapering down to a narrow waist. The trousers broke perfectly over his shoes. The tailoring hid the bulk of his holster entirely. He looked lethal, polished, and terrifyingly civilized. She approached him with her chalk, strictly out of habit. There was nothing to fix, but she needed the physical barrier of her job to keep her grounded. She walked around him, tugging at the lapels, checking the seam on the back of his shoulders. "It's good," he said, staring at his reflection in the trifold mirror. "It's perfect," she corrected him, kneeling to check the hem of the trousers. "I have a dinner tonight," Noah said. His voice rumbled above her. "A sit-down with the East Side crew. You're going to ensure I look exactly like this." She paused, a pin hovering over the wool. "I just tailored it. You're wearing it. My job is done." "No," Noah said, looking down at her as she crouched at his feet. "I need my cuffs adjusted. Bring your kit. You're coming with me." She stood up slowly, her knees popping. "I don't do out calls, especially not to mob dinners." "You do now." It wasn't a request. The dark, possessive intensity was back in his eyes, swallowing the brown. He wasn't taking her to tailor his cuffs. He was taking her to show her off, or to keep her where he could see her, or perhaps just to prove that he could. "I'm wearing jeans and a sweater covered in chalk," she said, a desperate final protest. "You look fine," Noah stated, turning back to the mirror, adjusting his cuffs. "Paulie will pick you up at 7. Lock the door when you leave, with a deadbolt." The restaurant was a dimly lit Italian place in Queens that felt more like a bunker than a dining establishment. There were no windows in the back room, just heavy mahogany paneling, red leather booths, and the overwhelming smell of roasted garlic, red wine, and old cigar smoke. Lyra sat in the corner booth, a ghost in her faded denim and gray sweater, clutching a leather sewing kit she didn't need. Noah sat at the center of the long table, flanked by Paulie and three other men who looked like they chewed glass for breakfast. Across from them sat the East Side crew. The tension in the room was so thick you could carve it with a steak knife. She kept her head down, staring at the scuffed toes of her boots. She felt wildly out of place, an exposed nerve in a room full of predators. They spoke in low, clipped sentences. Phrases like territory lines, shipping containers, and percentage cuts floated over the clinking of silverware. No one raised their voice. It was all horribly polite, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. About an hour in, a man across the table, a slick-looking guy in a cheap, shiny blue suit, leaned forward. His eyes bypassed Noah and landed squarely on Lyra. "So, Noah," the man slurred slightly, holding up a glass of red wine. "Who's the stray in the corner? You bringing civilians to business dinners now?" The room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Lyra froze, her fingers tightening around the handle of her sewing kit. Noah didn't look at the man right away. He calmly picked up his linen napkin, wiped the corner of his mouth, and placed it back on the table. When he finally looked up, his eyes were blank, void of any human warmth. "That's my tailor," Noah said, his voice quiet, carrying effortlessly across the silence. "She looks a little rough for a tailor," the man chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "Looks like you picked her up off the street. Tell you what, I got a guy in Midtown who can get you a real suit, none of this homemade garbage." Lyra's face burned. Humiliation warred, with the stark, cold fear paralyzing her limbs. Noah leaned back in his chair. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for the gun, hidden perfectly under the charcoal jacket she had made for him. He simply stared at the man in the blue suit. "Her name is Lyra," Noah said. The temperature in the room plummeted. "And she is the only person who touches my clothes. If you look at her again, Dominic, I'll take your eyes out and leave them in your wine glass." Dominic's smirk vanished. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly under the dim chandeliers. The older man sitting next to Dominic quickly placed a heavy hand on Dominic's forearm, forcing him back into his seat. "Apologies, Noah," the older man grunted. "The kid's drunk. It won't happen again." Noah didn't acknowledge the apology. He turned his head slowly and looked at Lyra. His expression softened slightly, a microscopic shift that only she could see from her corner. He gave her a single, slow nod. It wasn't an apology for putting her in this situation. It was a brand. Mine. When the dinner finally ended, the East Side crew practically scrambled out of the back room. Paulie and the others lingered, smoking cigarettes and drinking the dregs of the wine. Noah stood up and walked over to her booth. The smell of expensive wine and gunpowder rolled off him. "Let's go," he said, offering his hand. She looked at his large, rough hand for a long moment. If she took it, she was crossing a line. She was accepting the protection he just violently established. She ignored his hand and slid out of the booth on her own, her legs feeling like hollow reeds. "You didn't need to do that," she muttered as they walked toward the exit. "Do what?" "Threaten a man over comment about my clothes." Noah stopped in the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. The kitchen staff had cleared out, leaving only the harsh fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial bleach. He turned to face her, blocking her path entirely. "He insulted your work," Noah said softly. "I've had worse Yelp reviews," she shot back, rubbing her arms against the sudden chill of the hallway. "I don't need you cutting people's eyes out on my behalf. I'm a seamstress, Noah. I'm I'm not part of this." She gestured wildly at the empty restaurant. Noah stepped into her space, trapping her between the brick wall and his solid chest. "You are part of this now." "No, I'm not." She pushed her hands against his chest, intending to shove him away. It was like pushing a brick wall. He didn't budge. Instead, his hand came up, wrapping around the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in the loose hair falling from her bun. The grip was firm, holding her in place, forcing her to look up into his dark, relentless eyes. "You think this is a game?" Noah whispered, his breath warm against her forehead. "You think I brought you here to fix my cuffs?" "I think you brought me here to flex your muscles," she snapped, though her voice trembled, betraying her bravado. "I brought you here so they would see you," he corrected, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind her ear. "So every man at that table knows your face. So they know that if they walk into a tailor shop on 4th Street, they are walking onto my territory. I claimed you, Lyra." Her heart battered against her ribs, a chaotic, terrified rhythm. "I'm not property." "No," Noah agreed, leaning down till his lips were a fraction of an inch from hers. The smell of him was intoxicating, short-circuiting her brain. "You're a liability? My liability? And I protect what's mine." He didn't kiss her. The restraint was maddening, a physical ache pulling taut between them. He just held her gaze, letting the reality of his words sink into her bones, before he released her neck and stepped back, leaving her shivering in the harsh fluorescent light. The rain started on Tuesday, a relentless freezing downpour that turned the city streets into oily black mirrors. Lyra was walking home from the shop. She had refused Paulie's offer for a ride, stubbornly clinging to the last shred of her independence. It was a stupid, prideful decision. Her cheap trench coat was soaked through, the damp cold sinking deep into her joints. The streetlights flickered, fighting a losing battle against the dark. The garment district was a ghost town after 8 p.m., a labyrinth of closed metal grates and overflowing dumpsters. She clutched her umbrella tighter, her boots splashing through deep puddles, eager to get to her apartment and lock the heavy silver deadbolt. As she crossed the alleyway between a vacant warehouse and a dry cleaner, a shadow detached itself from the brick wall. "Hey, Lyra, right?" She stopped. The voice was slurred, familiar. A man stepped under the flickering amber glow of the street lamp. It was Dominic. The guy from the dinner. He looked worse than he had on Thursday. His shiny blue suit was rumpled and wet, and his face was bruised. A nasty purple swelling around his left eye. He smelled like stale beer, wet dog, and desperation. Her stomach plummeted. She instinctively took a step back, her hand dipping into her wet pocket to grab her keys, seeking the small pepper spray canister. "What do you want?" she demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady. Dominic spat on the pavement. "Moretti thinks he's so smart. Thinks he can embarrass me in front of my uncle." He took a stumbling step forward. "I just wanted to see what was so special about the tailor. See why he was willing to go to war over a stray." "I don't know what you're talking about. Back off." She pulled the pepper spray from her pocket, hiding it in the folds of her wet coat. Dominic laughed, a harsh scraping sound. He reached into his jacket. The metal caught the street lamp, the ugly blunt nose of a revolver. Time slowed down to a thick crawl. The rain felt like needles hitting her face. She couldn't breathe. The cynical, tough girl armor she wore evaporated, leaving just raw, paralyzing animal terror. "Maybe if I mess up his pretty little pet," Dominic sneered, raising the gun, "he'll learn some respect." She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the deafening crack, bracing for the end. The crack never came. Instead, there was a wet, sickening thud, followed by a sharp crack of breaking bone. She opened her eyes, gasping. Dominic was on the ground, shrieking in pain. His arm bent at a horrific, unnatural angle. The gun was skittering across the wet asphalt, spinning into a puddle. Standing over him was Paulie. The giant bodyguard didn't have an umbrella. Rain sluiced off his shaved head and thick leather jacket. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was taking out the trash. Paulie brought his heavy boot down on Dominic's ribs. There was another crack, and Dominic's shriek turned into a gurgling wheeze. "Paulie, stop!" she screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat. Paulie paused, looking at her with mild annoyance. He didn't step off Dominic. A sleek Blacktown car idled at the curb, indistinguishable in the rain until the back door pushed open. Noah stepped out. He didn't rush. He walked through the freezing downpour with the casual, terrifying grace of a man who owned the storm. He wore no coat, just a black suit, the rain immediately plastering his shirt to his chest. He didn't look at Dominic groveling and choking on the wet pavement. He walked straight to her. Before she could speak, before she could process the violence she had just witnessed, Noah grabbed her arms. His grip was bruising, his dark eyes frantic as they scanned her face, her neck, her hands. "Are you hit? Did he touch you?" His voice was rough, completely stripped of its usual calm control. "No," she choked out, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "No, I'm fine. I'm okay." Noah let out a harsh, jagged breath. He pulled her against his chest, crushing her to him. The smell of his wet suit, the heat of his body, the heavy, frantic thud of his heart. It enveloped her. Her umbrella dropped to the ground, rolling away in the wind. But she didn't care. She buried her face in his neck, her hands clutching his lapels, shaking violently. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her wet hair. "I told you," Noah murmured against her ear, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, absolute rage. "I told you you're a liability." He pulled back, just enough to look at her, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs wiping the freezing rain from her cheeks. His eyes were completely black in the dim light. Then, he turned his head and looked at Paulie, who was still standing over the broken man on the ground. Noah didn't yell. He didn't make a grand gesture. He just gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Paulie reached into his coat. "Get in the car, Lyra," Noah commanded softly, turning her away from the alley. "Noah, no," she started, grabbing his wrist. "Get in the car." It wasn't a request. He shoved her gently but firmly into the leather interior of the town car and slammed the door shut, trapping her in the quiet, climate-controlled bubble. The windows were tinted dark. 2 seconds later, a muffled pop echoed over the sound of the rain hitting the roof. She flinched, curling into a ball on the expensive leather seats, pressing her hands over her ears. The smell of the rich leather was suddenly nauseating. The driver's door opened and Paulie slid in, completely unfazed, wiping rain from his face. A moment later, the back door opened and Noah slid in beside her. He was soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer comfort. He just reached across the seat, grabbed her cold, shaking hand, and laced his fingers tightly through hers. His grip was a vice, anchoring her to the brutal reality of the world she had just been dragged into. She squeezed back, and that was the most terrifying part of all. The ride to wherever they were going was a masterclass in suffocating silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic, heavy thump of the windshield wipers pushing away the freezing rain, and the low hum of the town car's heater. The heat blew directly onto her soaked shins, turning the damp denim of her jeans stiff and uncomfortable. She stared at the partition separating them from the driver's seat. It was solid black. Noah's hand was still wrapped around hers. His palm was calloused, incredibly warm, and completely steady. Her own hand felt like a block of ice, trembling so hard the vibration transferred up her arm and into her shoulder. She couldn't unsee it. The wet thud of Paulie's boot against ribs. The casual way Noah had nodded. The muffled pop. Dominic was dead. A man with a shiny suit and terrible breath was lying in a puddle of dirty rainwater behind a dry cleaner, and she was sitting in the back of a luxury car, holding the hand of the man who ordered his execution. She tasted bile, sharp and acidic, at the back of her throat. She swallowed hard, closing her eyes against the nausea. "Breathe, Lyra," Noah said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the violent edge it had in the alley. It was just a command. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." She tried to pull her hand away to cover her face. He didn't let go. His grip just tightened a fraction, a physical tether keeping her from floating away into the panic. "You killed him." Her voice sounded like tearing paper. "I eliminated a threat to my property," Noah corrected, staring straight ahead at the black partition. "He pulled a gun on you. He forfeited his right to breathe the second his hand went into his coat." I had pepper spray," she stammered, the words absurd even as they left her mouth. Noah finally turned his head to look at her. His dark eyes dragged over her pale, wet face, lingering on the way her teeth chattered. "Pepper spray," he repeated flatly. "Against a snub-nosed 38. You would be in the morgue right now, and Dominic would be drinking at a bar in Queens, bragging about it to his uncle. That is the reality, Lyra. Don't sanitize it. He was right. She hated it, but he was right." The cynicism she prided herself on was a cheap, flimsy shield compared to the brutal mechanics of his world. The car slowed, taking a sharp turn down a ramp. The yellow glow of a subterranean parking garage washed over the tinted windows. They stopped. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "My building. You aren't going back to that apartment." "I have to go home. I have work tomorrow." Noah opened his car door. The cold air of the concrete garage flooded in. "Your shop is closed until I say otherwise. Get out." She didn't have the energy to fight. Her legs felt like they were filled with wet sand. She slid across the leather and stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light. Paulie was already at the elevator bank, pressing the call button. He didn't look at her. He didn't look like a man who had just taken a life. He looked bored. The elevator ride was a high-speed, ear-popping ascent. They stepped out directly into a penthouse. It didn't look like a Mafia den. There was no tacky gold trim or red velvet. It was a massive, sterile expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, and dark charcoal furniture. It smelled like expensive wood polish and the same bitter vetiver Noah wore. It was beautiful, cold, and entirely impenetrable. A fortress in the clouds. "Paulie, stay down here," Noah instructed, stripping off his soaked suit jacket and tossing it over a heavy leather chair. "Lyra, upstairs. First door on the left." She stood dripping on his expensive rug, her wet hair plastered to her neck. "I don't need—" "You're going into shock. You're freezing. Go take a shower before I throw you in it myself." He walked over to a dark wood cabinet and pulled out a heavy crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. He didn't look back at her. She climbed the floating glass staircase. Her wet boots squeaked against the steps. The bathroom was larger than her entire apartment. Slate tiles, a massive glass shower, and thick fluffy towels that looked like they belonged in a 5-star hotel. She stripped off her wet, cold clothes. They hit the floor with a heavy, depressing slap. She stood under the scalding water for what felt like an hour. She scrubbed her skin until it was bright red, trying to wash away the smell of rain, garbage, and gunpowder. She wanted to wash away the memory of the wet crunch of bone. Most of all, she wanted to wash away the sick, twisted sense of relief she had felt when Noah stepped out of that car. When she finally turned off the water, the mirror was completely fogged over. She wrapped herself in a massive, heavy towel. Sitting on the black marble counter was a folded piece of clothing, a black, oversized t-shirt. The cotton was impossibly soft, smelling faintly of his cologne. She put it on. It swallowed her, the hem hitting just above her knees. She felt like a child wearing her father's clothes, but the scent of him wrapped around her like a heavy protective blanket. She walked back downstairs barefoot. The concrete floor was cold against her toes. The lights were dimmed. Noah was sitting on the edge of the large charcoal sofa, staring out the massive windows at the glittering, rain-slicked grid of the city below. He had changed into dry clothes, dark sweatpants, and a plain black t-shirt that stretched tight across his chest. He held a low-ball glass in his hand, the ice clinking softly as he swirled the amber liquid. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, unsure of what to do with her hands. He didn't turn around, but he knew she was there. Men like him always knew exactly who was in the room. "Come here," he said. She hesitated, her bare feet rooted to the floor. "I should call a cab." "No cabs come here," he replied, taking a slow sip of his drink. "And you're not leaving. Come here." The exhaustion finally broke her stubbornness. She walked over and sat on the far edge of the sofa, leaving 3 feet of cushion between them. The leather was cold. Noah set his glass down on the glass coffee table. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes tracked the wet strands of her hair, the pale skin of her collarbone peeking out from the oversized collar of his shirt, and the way her hands were knotted tightly in her lap. He slid across the leather. He didn't ask permission. He closed the distance between them until his knee brushed hers. The heat radiating off him was immediate, a heavy contrast to the chill of the room. He reached out and took her knotted hands, pulling them apart. His thumbs rubbed slow, heavy circles over her knuckles. "You're still shaking," he observed. "I've never seen anyone die before." Her voice cracked. "I know. How do you just drink whiskey? How are you not out of your mind?" "Because Dominic was a dog who needed to be put down, and because you're sitting here, breathing." Noah's voice was dark, vibrating in his chest. "If he had touched you, Lyra, if he had put his hands on you, a bullet would have been a mercy. I would have taken him apart piece by piece." She looked up into his eyes. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his obsession was laid bare. There was no apology in his face, no remorse, just a primal, possessive violence that he wielded exclusively for her. She should have run. She should have been repulsed. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her forehead against the center of his chest. Noah let out a heavy, shuddering breath. His large hands moved from her knuckles to her back, pulling her fully against him. One hand settled heavy on the nape of her neck, fingers tangling in her damp hair, while the other wrapped tightly around her waist, anchoring her to his lap. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, calm beat of his heart under the soft cotton of his shirt. It was the same heartbeat she had felt under her hand on Monday, right after she stabbed him with a pin. It felt like a lifetime ago. "You're mine now," he whispered into her hair, a quiet, absolute vow. "You understand that, don't you?" She didn't answer. She just buried her face deeper into his chest, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of his world completely envelop her. Lyra woke up to the smell of black coffee and the harsh, bright glare of morning sun cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was in a bed the size of a small country. The sheets were incredibly high-thread count cotton, cool and heavy against her bare legs. For about 3 seconds, her brain was blissfully blank. She stretched, her toes reaching for the edge of the mattress, her muscles sore and heavy. Then the memory of the alley crashed into her like a physical blow. The gun, the crunch of ribs, the muffled pop. She sat up so fast the room spun. She was still wearing Noah's black t-shirt. The bed beside her was empty, the sheets cool to the touch. He had been up for a while. She pushed the heavy duvet off and swung her legs over the edge. Her feet hit the thick plush rug. The silence of the penthouse was oppressive. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a Sunday morning. It was a pressurized silence, like the air inside a submarine. She walked out of the bedroom and padded down the short hallway. The living room was flooded with cold, pale sunlight. Noah was sitting at a massive granite kitchen island. He was dressed in a crisp white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and dark tailored trousers. He had a tablet propped up in front of him, and he was scrolling through something with his right hand, a mug of black coffee in his left. A small, dark blue bruise was blossoming along his jawline, a parting gift from the rain, or perhaps from the kickback of his world that she hadn't seen. He didn't look up when she walked in, but he pushed a secondary steaming mug across the granite counter. "Drink," he said, his voice a low gravel scrape in the quiet room. She stopped a few feet from the island. The surreal domesticity of the scene made her skin crawl. He was drinking coffee and reading the news. 12 hours ago, he had ordered an execution. "I need my clothes," she said, her voice sounding incredibly thin. Noah finally looked up. His dark eyes flicked over, taking in his oversized shirt, her bare legs, and her defensive posture. He didn't smile, but a heavy possessive satisfaction settled over his features. "They're in the trash," he said calmly. "They smelled like garbage and dirty rainwater. Polly went to your apartment and packed a bag. It's in the guest room." Her jaw dropped. A hot, bright flash of pure anger finally burned through the lingering fog of trauma. "He went into my apartment? Again? Without my permission?" "You don't have a secure apartment, Lyra. You have a wooden box in a bad neighborhood." Noah took a sip of his coffee. "And considering a man just pulled a gun on you, I'm not particularly interested in your boundaries right now." She marched over to the island, slamming her hands flat against the cold granite. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to hijack my life because you decided to play vigilante." "I am not playing," Noah said, his voice dropping an octave. He set his mug down with a sharp clack. "I don't play. Dominic's uncle runs the east side. By tonight, he's going to know what happened to his nephew. The street is going to be hot. You are not going back to that neighborhood." "I have a business," she shouted, the sound echoing harshly off the glass windows. "I have clients. Mrs. Gable needs her hem by tomorrow. Mr. Henderson is coming in for a fitting. I can't just disappear into your ivory tower." "Mrs. Gable can buy a new dress," Noah snapped, standing up. The sheer size of him suddenly dominated the kitchen. "Mr. Henderson can buy a suit off the rack. You are not stepping foot outside this building." You're keeping me hostage. I am keeping you alive. I didn't ask you to. The words hung in the air, a reckless, stupid lie. She hadn't asked him, but she had leaned into him when the gun was drawn. She had buried her face in his neck. He knew it, and she knew it. Noah stepped around the kitchen island. She instinctively took a step back, but her heel caught the edge of the bar stool, throwing her off balance. Before she could stumble, his hand shot out, wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was entirely unyielding. He didn't pull her to him gently. He yanked her forward, trapping her against his chest. You didn't ask me to, he breathed, his face inches from hers. The smell of his expensive soap and dark coffee was suffocating. When you were shaking in my car last night, you weren't complaining. When you slept in my bed, wearing my clothes, you weren't complaining. I was in shock, she argued, twisting her arm against his grip. It was useless. I am a tailor, Noah. I'm not your mob wife. I'm not part of your violent, twisted life. You stabbed me with a pin the day we met, Lyra, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. His free hand came up, wrapping around her throat. He didn't squeeze. It wasn't a chokehold. It was a heavy, dominant collar of flesh and bone. His thumb pressed against the frantic, fluttering pulse under her jaw. You didn't flinch. You didn't apologize like a normal civilian. You looked at me like I was just another piece of meat in your shop. She swallowed hard, her throat working against the pressure of his palm. Let me go. I can't. The honesty in his voice was raw, jagged. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession. His eyes dropped to her mouth. The anger between them suddenly inverted, collapsing into something hot, heavy, and infinitely more dangerous. The adrenaline pumping through her veins from the argument morphed instantly into a desperate, gnawing need. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't romantic. It was a collision. His mouth was hard and demanding, tasting of bitter coffee and dark obsession. His teeth clashed against hers, a messy, frantic attempt to consume and claim. Every rational thought in her brain screamed at her to push him away. He was a criminal. He was dangerous. He had blood on his hands, but her body betrayed her brain. Her hands, which had been pushing against his chest, curled into the crisp fabric of his white shirt, gripping him tightly. She opened her mouth, letting him in, answering the violence of his kiss with her own desperate, imperfect heat. He groaned, a low animal sound in the back of his throat. He let go of her arm, wrapping both arms entirely around her, lifting her slightly off the cold floor. She wrapped her legs around his waist, clinging to him like a lifeline on a sinking ship. He walked them backward, slamming her back against the wall of the hallway. The impact knocked the breath out of her, but he swallowed her gas with his mouth. His hands roamed frantically over her back, gripping the thin cotton of the t-shirt, pulling her flush against the hard, unforgiving lines of his body. It was messy. It was desperate. It was entirely fueled by fear, adrenaline, and the toxic realization that she belonged to him now. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily, sucking in the cool air of the penthouse. Her lips felt bruised, tingling with the heavy, lingering pressure of his mouth. He rested his forehead against hers. His chest heaved against her breasts. "You're not going back to the shop today, Lyra," he said, his voice wrecked, completely stripped of its polished veneer. She closed her eyes, a single cynical tear escaping the corner of her eye, dampening his cheek. She hated him for trapping her. She hated herself for wanting to stay in the cage. "Okay," she whispered. It took 3 weeks for the heat on the street to die down. 3 weeks of living in the glass cage in the sky, pacing the polished concrete floors, watching the city move below her like an ant farm. When Noah finally told her she could go back to the shop, Lyra thought she would feel a sense of triumphant liberation. She thought she would walk in, throw open the blinds, and reclaim her life. Instead, when the Blacktown car pulled up to the curb on 4th Street, it just felt like moving from a large cell to a smaller one. The air in the shop still smelled like damp wool and dust, but it was overlaid with the distinct heavy scent of stale cigarette smoke. Paulie was sitting on a folding chair by the frosted glass door, a newspaper resting on his massive knees, completely blocking the exit. He didn't look up when she walked in. He just turned a page. She walked to the back of the shop, dropping her bag on the cutting table. The wood felt familiar under her fingertips, but the magic was gone. The independence she had forged in this dusty room felt hollow, like a prop on a stage. She spent the morning organizing threads she had already organized and sweeping a floor that was already clean. No customers came in. The neighborhood knew. You didn't just walk into a shop guarded by the Capo's right-hand man to get a pair of pants hemmed. At exactly 1 o'clock, the bell above the door jingled. She didn't turn around right away. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the air pressure, the sudden heavy gravity entering the room. She placed the heavy shears down on the cutting table and turned around. Noah was standing on the fitting pedestal in the center of the room. He wore a dark navy suit, one she hadn't made, and a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He stood perfectly still, a dark monolith in the dusty light of the shop. "The shoulders are off," Noah said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet room. She picked up her yellow measuring tape from the table. It felt weightless in her hands now, no longer armor, just a piece of plastic. She walked over to the pedestal. Her boots sounded heavy on the floorboards. She didn't say a word. She just stepped up onto the small wooden stool, bringing her face level with his chest. She looped the tape around his broad shoulders. The familiar smell of him, vetiver, ozone, and dark coffee washed over her. Her knuckles brushed the hard line of his collarbone. She didn't flinch. Her hands didn't tremble. She pulled the tape taut, looking at the number. 46, she murmured. She moved to measure his chest, kneeling down to wrap the tape just under his arms. She felt the steady, heavy thud of his pulse. It was the same rhythm she had fallen asleep to every night for the past 3 weeks. She stood back up, looking at the suit. "It's an off-the-rack piece, Noah. I can take the shoulders in, but the drape will never be perfect." "Fix it anyway," he said. He wasn't looking at the mirror. He was looking down at her. His dark eyes were intense, heavy, stripping away the mundane reality of the tailor shop and pulling her back into the dark, possessive orbit he had created. He watched her hands move, tracking the precise, practiced motions of her fingers. "Do you have a boyfriend, Lyra?" The question hit the air exactly the way it had a month ago. Low, scraping the bottom of his throat. A demand for data. She froze, the chalk hovering an inch from his lapel. She remembered the first time he asked, the terrifying snap of his lighter, the suffocating fear, the cynical defiance she had tried to wrap around herself like a cheap coat. She looked up at his face, the jagged, pale line of the scar in his jaw, the slight bend of his broken nose, the absolute, unyielding possession in his dark eyes. There was no stuttering this time, no awkward stumble backward. There was no fear, only a heavy fatalistic acceptance of the truth. She had stabbed him. He had killed for her. They had bled into each other until the lines blurred completely. She dropped the chalk. It hit the wooden floorboard with a soft, hollow clack. She didn't step back. She stepped forward, closing the final inch of space between them, her chest brushing against the rough wool of his jacket. She reached up, her fingers gripping the lapels of his suit, pulling him slightly down toward her. "No," she said, her voice steady, stripped of all sarcasm, echoing in the quiet, dusty cage of the shop. "I don't." Noah's eyes darkened, the pupils blowing wide, eclipsing the brown. But this time, it wasn't jealousy. It was victory. His large hand came up, wrapping around the back of her neck, his thumb pressing heavy against the frantic pulse beneath her jaw, anchoring her perfectly, permanently in place. The tape measures put away, but the tension is just beginning. If you are captivated by Lyra and Noah's dark, twisted dance, don't just walk past the shop. Step inside. Hit that like button to show your support for raw, gritty storytelling that doesn't pull its punches. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter of our original Mafia romances. Got a friend who loves morally gray men and cynical heroines? Share this video with them right now. Drop a comment below. Do you think Lyra surrendered, or did she finally take control? See you in the next one.